Today, I'm going to talk about an important world trend, namely the rise of populism, or what is also known as populist politics in recent years. There is a widespread belief among the scholars that this trend is very important and deserves more attention simply because populism and populist politics undermine democracy, state institutions, as well as legitimate political actors. In recent years, we have been observing the rise of populist politics in many diverse countries, such as election of Donald Trump in United States, the rise of Brexiters in United Kingdom, election of Bolsonaro in Brazil, Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Kaczynski in Poland, or Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, and so forth. So the question is, are we having a populist moment that will go away soon? Or is this rather a long-term populist period that will stay with us for maybe several years, if not decades to come? It is very difficult to find a sound answer to this question, to which I will come back later. I think first we need to understand the basic characteristics of populism or populist politics before we can tackle this question. Let's start with the definition of the concept populism. According to Wikipedia, which I think offers a good definition, in quote, populism refers to a range of political stances that emphasize the idea of the people and often juxtapose this group against the elite. The term developed in the 19th century and has been applied to various politicians, parties, and movements since that time, although has been rarely chosen as a self-description, unquote. Nonetheless, many scholars believe that it is difficult to define populism since it appeared in different ways in different times. It suffices to say that it can be seen both on the right and the left of the political spectrum, though the most well-known examples are the right-wing leaders, political parties, and movements. The next debate on populism is whether it can be categorized as an ideology or a practical strategy in the form of a style or discourse used by the populist leaders, parties, or movements. Nonetheless, according to many scholars, populism and populist politics of current times have two core principles. Number one, populist politicians claim that they speak on behalf of the ordinary people, the so-called silent masses. And number two, ordinary people should stand against the elite establishment. We can see this phenomenon taking place both on the right and the left of the political spectrum. While on the right, populist leaders emphasize mostly sociocultural issues, primarily increased migration, which is a current event. On the left, the focus is more on socioeconomic grievances, such as economic inequalities and unfair distribution of wealth, both on national as well as on the global level. For example, President of the United States, Donald Trump, focuses on the immigrants and the need to block, for example, Mexican immigrants through the use of preposterous methods, such as building a wall across the border or even shooting the immigrants from their legs so that they are prevented from crossing the border. The Brexiters, on the other hand, emphasize the preservation of British sovereignty from foreign interventions and so forth. On the left of the political spectrum, the Syriza movement in Greece and Podemos movement in Spain both challenged the established socioeconomic systems in their respective countries by focusing on the issues of socioeconomic inequalities and unfair distribution of wealth, and both succeeded in the general elections. Populist parties and leaders appeal to the ordinary people through advocating change. They emphasize need for urgent structural change in economy as well as in cultural issues. They usually promote a sense of crisis in the country and present themselves as the only agent that can bring a solution to the alleged crisis. Though the world has gone through a similar populist era as a reaction to what is known as the first globalization that can be roughly attributed to the period between 1870 to the beginning of World War I. I think that the current populist phenomenon became more visible and grew rapidly after the 2007 financial crisis and the successive 2008 Great Recession. Just to back up a little and look at the global trends in recent decades more closely, I think can clarify the necessary background for our better understanding of the current trends. Francis Fukuyama was almost certain in 1992 in his famous book entitled The End of History and the Last Man, which was based on his 1989 essay, The End of History, that liberal democracy aligned with globalization is unchallenged. It was argued that liberal democracy defeated first fascism in World War II and more recently communism with the end of the Cold War. Hence, now there is no ideology left to challenge, let alone replace liberal democracy. Many liberals believe that liberal democracy would finally spread all around the world through globalization, and hence they saw globalization as almost like a panacea, cure for all. However, despite all the benefits of globalization, such as huge economic growth on the global scale and stunning technological developments that have made our lives easier, economic inequalities and unfair distribution of wealth between and within the countries became more acute. The 1990s and 2000s, in addition to these, also witnessed the rise in number of intrastate conflicts in the form of ethnic and religious wars. Here, more people started to question the merits and validity of liberal democracy as well as globalization. As I mentioned before, the 2007 financial crisis and the 2008 Great Recession came as the last straw. The inability of the governments to successfully deal with the financial crisis and the Great Recession created the fertile ground and the appeal for anti-establishment messages and populist politics. Ordinary people started questioning how much the existing political elites and elected officials are in touch with the everyday concerns and interests of the ordinary citizens. This created a us versus them sentiment and opened up a fertile channel for populist movements. We started seeing populist leaders and parties in the US, the UK, Brazil, Israel, France, Turkey, Poland, Hungary, Venezuela, and so forth, supposedly establishing close connections with the ordinary people and supposedly representing and protecting ordinary people's interests. For them, the traditional elites are out there to maintain their own corrupt self-interests. What is in common with these new agents is that they are usually anti-establishment, anti-elites, and anti-institutional. Hence, they are a challenge to democracy, a challenge to true liberal democracy. In that sense, they oppose to the courts, the media, bureaucracy, and more, the checks and balances of the state institutions, because the populist leaders see these as obstacles. That is why we see growing authoritarianism in countries ruled by populist leaders, such as in Hungary, Poland, Turkey, Brazil, and so forth. Now, maybe we can turn back to the original question we asked at the beginning. That is, are we living in a populist moment, or what we experience today is beyond a moment, and rather it is a long-term populist period? In his 1991 book entitled The Third Wave, Democratization in the Late 20th Century, Samuel Huntington talks about how countries democratize in waves. He defines a democratic wave as, quote, a group of transitions from non-democratic to democratic regimes that occur within a specific period of time and that significantly outnumber transitions in the opposite directions during that period of time, unquote. For Huntington, the late 20th century, the 1990s, was a period where we see, especially after the end of the Cold War, was a period where we see a huge proliferation in the number of non-democracies transitioning into democracies. To me, it is clear that since 9/11, this democratization trend has come to a halt, and in fact, it has been reversed. In that sense, if the current trend of rising populism is not seriously challenged by democratic forces, then there is a good possibility that we will be in a reversed third wave, to use Huntington's terminology, where we will observe more rising authoritarian populist politics in the foreseeable future. Hence, what we experience today would probably be termed as a long-term populist period rather than a populist moment in the future. At this point, one can ask the question then, what needs to be done in order to challenge and fence off the current populist politics? For that, I have a three-pillar plan. Number one, building white national and global democracy coalitions. These coalitions should be participatory, and especially they should be inclusive of young people and women who are still very much underrepresented in national, international, as well as supranational platforms. These democracy coalitions should include both elites and representation of the ordinary citizen. Furthermore, these democracy coalitions should include both states and non-state actors. Here, for example, global institutions like the United Nations should work with the relevant states as well as movements, such as the one initiated by Greta Thunberg on climate change, towards a common vision based on shared values and principles. Number two, defending democratic institutions and mechanisms to protect and support democratic constitutions and democratic practices while fencing off disruptive populism. In that sense, democratic institutions and constitutions should develop necessary safeguards to deal with and prevent populist agents from taking over them through the use of democratic means. And number three, identifying common problems such as inequalities and unfair distribution of wealth, both on the national and global levels. Let's not forget about the community levels, and come up with inclusive measures to erase these problems based on shared principles and values, as well as methods well grounded in scientific research and evidence. To me, only such a comprehensive democracy coalitions, armed with a common vision, the right principles and values, as well as scientifically grounded methods, can reverse the potentially long-term populist period to a populist moment.